So thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this seminar and for inviting the ministry to talk about the Transparency Act. I have 10 minutes and I would like to talk first about a little bit about the background for the Transparency Act and then about the Transparency Act. It will be a brief introduction. So the background. 2013 Rana Plaza tragedy, which most of you, if not all of you, have heard about, of course, represents a big shift in the public perception. And this is a tragedy where a building collapsed and more than 1,000 workers died and more than 2,500 workers were injured. And this tragedy led to a widespread discussion about corporate social responsibility. And around the world, with civil society and unions in front, stressed the importance of going from a voluntary approach to a binding rules approach in order to make sure that businesses respect human rights and have decent working conditions in supply chains around the world. We know that businesses today already have well-developed routines and that they already have an active focus on challenges concerning human rights and working conditions. However, we also know that this is not the case for many or for most of enterprises, and therefore there has been developed a consensus on the importance of going to binding rules in order to address these challenges. So the regular development, which Norway is a part of with the Transparency Act, you can see the OECD guidelines and the UNGP representing the internationally recognized principle and guidelines, which Norway already today expects all of their companies to have knowledge about and to comply with. And in the middle, you see a list of countries that have, through the last years, developed different national legislation and which Norway is part of it. Some of those in the list already have national legislation and some of them are drafting it as we speak. And what you also see at the right is that also the Commission, the EU Commission, has joined this wave of developing regulatory frames, and that this February this year they presented their proposal where they had a directive where they also try to address the same challenges, and where they also try to create a European common framework. So what all of these countries are trying to do in a different ways, and including the Norway with the Transparency Act, is by binding rules, making sure that enterprises increase their focus on what impacts their activities have on human rights and working conditions, to ensure that they are able to identify negative impacts, potential and actual impacts, and that they are able to address those with appropriate measures. So that is the goal with this different legislation, including the Transparency Act. And the Transparency Act was presented by the government last year to the Parliament, and it was adopted the same year. And as you know, it will enter into force in only 1 month from now. So the Transparency Act. Let's start with the name. The name gives a good description about what this act is all about. The act relating to enterprises, transparency, and work on fundamental human rights and decent working conditions. And if we go to the purpose of the act, which you find in section 1 of the Transparency Act, you will see that there's a twofold purpose. Number one, the purpose is to promote enterprises' respect for fundamental human rights and decent working conditions in connection with production of goods and the provision of services. And it's also to ensure the general public access to information regarding how enterprises address adverse impacts on fundamental human rights and decent working conditions. The Transparency Act is based on internationally recognized guidelines and standards, such as the OECD guidelines and the UNGP. These guidelines, the Norwegian government already expects all their companies to have knowledge about and to comply with these. And the Act is also based on that expectation. And the Act is also can be seen as being part of a broader work in meeting the UN sustainability goals, especially number 8 and number 12. However, what you will see is that the Transparency Act has, of course, a narrower scope than these international standards. The Norwegian government and parliament here has focused on a part of what the international guidelines and standards cover. We can see that the Transparency Act covers, and we can say only covers, fundamental human rights and decent working conditions. And you can see that the Transparency Act applies only to larger enterprises. So although the Norwegian government, parliament, have chosen to focus on fundamental human rights and on decent working conditions, and it had focused to have a legal focus on larger companies, it's important to know that the government still expects all of the enterprises, no matter the size, to comply with these international standards and to comply with the entire OECD and the UNGP. So this being said, this is the scope, the material scope, and the scope of who applies applicable to the Transparency Act. If we go further, we will look at the obligations in the Transparency Act. The Transparency Act we can categorize them into two main categories. One is the duty to carry out due diligence, and then you have the duty to provide information. First, we can start with the duty to carry out due diligence. The Transparency Act in Section 4 states that enterprises have to conduct due diligence assessments related to fundamental human rights and decent working conditions in accordance with the OECD guidelines. Here you can see the due diligence wheel from the OECD guidelines, which I hope that most of you recognize. And it was very important for the Norwegian government not to create a new due diligence method, not to create a new system parallel to the OECD system. No, because the due diligence method within the OECD guidelines is well recognized, it works, and we want to an act that is based on this method, meaning that the legal text in the Transparency Act is based on this wheel with the 6 steps, the same 6 steps that the due diligence is about. And of course, it's modified in order to fit into the Transparency Act. And what is the idea here is that when a business is conducting due diligence according to the Transparency Act, it is at the same time conducting due diligence in line with the OECD guidelines and vice versa. Of course, again, within the narrow scope of the Transparency Act. That is the idea. And the Transparency Act also includes some of the important principles from the OECD guidelines, being that the due diligence assessments have to be risk-based, proportionate, and that they have to be done on a regular basis. And there's also a duty to publish an account of the due diligence assessments. And you can see here the date for the first deadline for that. So the idea here with the due diligence is to help and make sure that enterprises identify negative impacts from their businesses in their supply chains, and that they're able to address those with appropriate measures. That is what the due diligence method is all about, and what the Transparency Act is all about. Second duty is a duty to disclose information. So, upon written request, enterprises have to respond to inquiries for information regarding how the enterprise addresses actual and potential adverse impacts revealed in a due diligence assessment. The idea here is that consumers, other businesses, civil society, journalists, investors, and so on, everyone can ask enterprises about their due diligence assessment. And this is the idea here is that this is to make more transparency regarding human rights conditions, working conditions, and about how businesses address those challenges. That is the idea. So everyone has the right to get replies when they ask for those information. And this can be either general information or information related to specific goods or services. So the duty to conduct due diligence and the duty to provide information together, we hope that this will help to achieve the goal, the purpose of the Act, which I presented earlier to you. And having this goal in mind, this purpose of the Act in mind, the Norwegian Consumer Agency is given a duty to provide guidance to the enterprises and to supervise that the duties in the Act are complied with. So as you know, the Act will enter into force in only 1 month from now. And of course, from a ministerial perspective, it will be very interesting to see how the Act is received, how it will be practiced, and what effect the Act will have on human rights and on working conditions in global supply chains. Thank you very much for your attention.